For today's session, hopefully you can see by the screen here, and we're going to be walking through how to build enterprise architecture roadmaps. There's a few things that we'll be covering off. Initially, we'll be going through some slides to talk through some of the terminology we use and some of the background for roadmaps. But during those, we'll also be diving into Abacus itself to take a look at that content. So as a brief agenda for today's session, hopefully you'll see that, of course, those initial definitions will be slide-based. And then the 4 types of roadmaps that we'll be covering, again, is where we'll be jumping into Abacus. Just as a brief introduction, however, Avolution produces a tool called Abacus, which is the leading enterprise architecture tool within the industry. And I'm speaking to you today from London. My name's Andrew Luthwaite. I'm the pre-sales lead at Avolution. And I usually conduct things like these webinars, proof of concepts for Abacus, and anyone who's interested in a demonstration of the tool in terms of its capabilities, please feel free to reach out to me and my team, and we can certainly set one of those sessions up for you for more detail. Generally speaking, though, as an organization, we've been going for about 23 years or so now. I've been here for just over 10 of those years. And offices worldwide, like I said, I'm based from our London office today. We have offices globally. So if you wanted to reach out to your local Abacus representative, again, please feel free to do so. They'll be more than happy to organize specific sessions for you, whether that's overview demonstrations of the tool itself or discussions on particular use cases that you're working on. You'll also see that we are a leader within the Gartner Magic Quadrant and the Forrester Wave reports. There's various aspects to these. There are user reviews through Gartner's MQ. There's the Gartner CCA assessment. And then, of course, there's the Forrester Wave reports. I encourage you to take a look at those. They can provide some good insights into some of the pros and cons with EA tools, but they can also provide some good direction for specific tools for specific use cases as well. It goes without mentioning, because of our offices worldwide, we then do have thousands of Abacus users across the world, in over 100 different countries as well. So that becomes really beneficial for not just sharing content with the community that we have, but also making sure that we can work on the very specific use cases across these global organizations as well. You'll also see that the support for an unlimited number of different frameworks and notations in Abacus. It's worth highlighting that at this point, I'm aware from an EA perspective, there's usually some lean towards the use of something like TOGAF or Archimate or business process modeling. And certainly today we'll be covering some of those in the type of work that we'll be going through. To focus on today's session, what is road mapping? And certainly from my experience, when we get asked this question, even from a tool perspective, there are many different answers to this. Generally speaking, road mapping is a strategically planning for change. Now, for most organizations, what this means is the change could be specific things in terms of internal changes. So decommissioning applications, working on specific projects or programs, or any other type of process change potentially within the team. Externally, this could mean new regulations that come into play or various disruptors that come into the industry. Road mapping for these changes is essential, and I believe everyone probably does have some form of roadmap, and we'll later on discuss the types of these. But even if you think you aren't producing roadmaps right now, the chances are you are, based on some of the views that we'll see later on. Also, when we start looking at roadmaps, there's usually some aspect of time to this. So when are these changes occurring? When do we need to become compliant with specific regulations or industry standards? Time, of course, is usually a critical part of a roadmap. And strategically speaking, these could be long-term roadmaps or short-term roadmaps. And certainly the tools and methods that we use to discuss the types of roadmaps that we build will fall into those different categories as well. So for today's session, there are 4 types that we'll be going through. We'll provide a very quick high-level overview of the type first, and then we're actually going to jump into Abacus, just so I can show you a live environment of what that view looks like. So the 4 types you can see on here are certainly not exhaustive, but they're certainly the ones that we see the biggest changes within organizations, and they're certainly a good starting point for most customers that we work with. So type 1 in here is tagging with recommendations. This is really where we start thinking of properties or attributes in Abacus. Type 2 incorporates more of the when, so life cycle dates. Type 3 is usually a bit more about the how. So what projects and programs are we working on, and what kind of change is actually occurring within the organization? And type 4 really looks at modeling different scenarios. Quite often when we think of roadmaps, they're not necessarily one direction or linear. We typically have multiple options that we're considering. We typically want to be comparing different scenarios or states in time. And really, this ends up being some kind of trade-off between the options that we have. So again, we'll be going through each of these. And towards the end of today's session, I'll also give you an idea of different types of roadmaps that can build on these types right now. And they're typically going to be more advanced things once these four have been produced within Abacus. So the first type we have here is tagging with suggestions and heat maps. Again, there are times when people may not consider this to be specifically a roadmap, but in our view, tagging things with recommendations or heat maps allows us to understand what's going to change within the organization. So we can start tagging different elements, and what you can see here is a capability map in Abacus. And there are different processes and capabilities that have been tagged with specific recommendations or some kind of strategic intent. So these values could be coming from other parts of the model, or they could be managed directly on each of these processes and capabilities. There is a general rule here, of course, that when we start tagging things, and we want to make sure that there's either a replacement for this, or there is some kind of relationship to a base that covers the needs for each of these processes and capabilities. So we have to make this change with some kind of intent within the model. We don't really want to be tagging things without anything that backs that up from a data perspective. Now, what does that look like in Abacus? Well, let's jump into Abacus Enterprise. And in here, you can see the dashboard that looks at the business concepts within this organization. This is the business capability map that you would have seen in that slide deck. And what this is doing is it's highlighting some of those heat mapping elements within this model. Now, the benefit of this, of course, is that this is a live environment for any user to access. So anyone in the organization can jump into Abacus Enterprise and they can start viewing some of the changes that are going to be happening to these particular capabilities or processes. Furthermore, if we really wanted to, we could give users access to this data and we can allow them to make changes to each of these processes and capabilities as well. In this case, develop vision and strategy, if I scroll down, has a recommendation to retire. Probably wise that we don't retire a capability to develop our vision and strategy. So we might want to invest in this particular process or capability. And that's something that can then be set across that entire model. Now, keep in mind, we're making some of these changes manually in Abacus, but it might not always be the case that we want to make these manually. And we also might want to automate these going forward. So these could be recommendations that flow up from other parts of the model. And that's certainly something that we'll take a look at later on during some more of the advanced road mapping techniques that we have. Also worth keeping in mind, just because we're tagging things on this particular capability map as a diagram, that doesn't stop us from just building lists of information and using the same tagging mechanisms from that list base. So we don't have to produce visual representations in terms of diagrams or drawings. We can, of course, keep to building those recommendation values from a list-based way. Of course, that becomes really useful if we're integrating Abacus to other sources of information and importing different data sets. That means that we have an easier way of maintaining that information. So certainly tagging is going to be one of the first ports of call for this type of model. Now, tagging with heat mapping and recommendations, of course, doesn't just stop at the process and capability level. In Abacus Enterprise, we have the ability of building dashboards across various domains. So we might be tagging things with recommendations across our technology landscape, across our application landscape, or across any type of domain that we want to be modeling in Abacus. Okay, so that really covers the first type of roadmap here from tagging and recommendation perspective. It becomes one of the easiest places to start. Most organizations we work with have some kind of strategic recommendation value that they're working towards, whether that's manual or automated via a calculation. Either way, that provides some kind of direction for the organization to head in. Now, once we know what we want to change, we typically then want to understand when is that change happening. Now, traditionally, this would have been through things like Gantt charts, and certainly we'll take a look at one of those today. But specifically, when we start thinking of life cycle dates in Abacus, we usually categorize these into two different types. So we might consider life cycle dates that we can control. Usually these are internal life cycle dates, end of life dates, into production dates for systems or services. And then we have life cycle dates that are usually out of our control, so external things. These could be regulation dates coming into play, or more traditionally, for things like technology roadmaps or application roadmaps, we'd be looking at things like end of vendor support dates or end of support dates. So when we start looking at life cycles, this is really looking at when these changes are going to come into effect. Now, there are a couple of other aspects to consider around life cycle dates. These could be direct dates, so dates that sit specifically on top of the applications or technologies, or they could be inherited or inferred from the connections across the model. So again, when we start thinking of roadmaps, and most often the customers that I speak to, some level of time or life cycle date forms a critical part of those roadmaps. Understanding what is changing is important, but most of the time we obviously want to understand when that change is happening as well. Gantt charts typically are going to be built within project portfolio management tools or EA tools. But one of the ways that we want to make sure we can create benefits from those is making them interactive and dynamic. So let's jump back into Abacus Enterprise. And this time, let's take an approach of looking at the list of technologies that we have within this organization. So we can jump to a technology dashboard. And there's going to be a few different views on here that we might initially want to consider. We might be using these dashboards to build specific charts, understanding costs of technologies, understanding the split of these technologies across virtual physical servers, or understanding a supplier concentration map for the technologies. So where are we heavily reliant on a specific supplier, as an example. However, if we scroll down, what we're likely going to be considering right now are the life cycle dates for these Gantt charts. So you can see in here, we're currently looking at these platform services at a top level. And what this means is that each of these technologies are grouped in Abacus, usually according to a specific function. But in some cases, of course, you might be grouping these according to a specific supplier as well. So in this example, let's expand this Gantt style view, and let's drill down into the groups of technologies that we currently have. So we can see some application servers, web servers, database servers, and operating systems. And each of these will have lifecycle dates of their own. Again, it's not very common that we're typically capturing the lifecycle date of a grouping of technologies. And in this instance, we're not actually capturing that information manually. Abacus is automatically inferring the lifecycle dates, taking the minimum and maximum of all the technologies that sit underneath this grouping. So in this case, the minimum maximum dates are going to apply to the top level, and then each of these technologies will have their own lifecycle dates. So for example, we can see the end of support or obsolete dates for some of these technologies, and that can help us make some kind of strategic decision as to what we want to be doing with that technology. This is the first level of understanding the impact across the organization, although it's going to be much more useful then if we drill down into that technology to see the dependencies underneath. So which applications within this organization have a dependency or a requirement for this particular technology? Now, interestingly, the reason we want to use these types of views is to actually understand this gap. We have a technology that's running obsolete, and yet we have applications here that still require the technology, yet aren't going to be end of life until a significant time in the future. This is one of the ways of identifying those gaps. And in practice, there's a few things we can do with this. So of course, the first thing is there a replacement technology in place? So are these applications migrating to a newer technology? If not, what's the actual status of this application? So for example, we might want to quickly highlight whether these applications are all being retired, and maybe those dates just need to be adjusted to reflect that true version of what the application looks like. Another alternative is that we actually issue waivers in the model. We've noticed that, of course, there's going to be some level of risk of still using or deploying an application that's using an unsupported technology, but we might be happy to sit with that level of risk for the time being. So there's a number of different ways that we can analyze this type of situation, but these Gantt charts just allow us to drill down through that model to understand some of those changes across the organization. Now, as I mentioned previously, these don't just have to be technology or application focused. Of course, we might be producing these for services that come into play, if we're monitoring standards and regulations and how that affects our data or specific security classifications around that data, we might be looking at building those types of roadmaps. Or we might be building more higher level strategic roadmaps for the organization in terms of the projects and programs, but around the objectives and the desires of the organization to reach those objectives as well. So keep in mind, lifecycle dates are going to be really useful when we start looking at a time-based aspect, but for most users, this becomes a key part of what we typically consider a roadmap in Abacus. Now, the third type of roadmap really just extends on this capability of monitoring both what the changes are and when those changes are occurring, to understanding how those changes are going to be impacting the organization. The view that you're seeing here is a typical, what we kind of call work package view, a terminology usually within the Archimate and TOGAF standards and notations, and something you might be familiar with, but traditionally, we would usually kind of classify these as more kind of project or program-based changes within the architecture. So diagrams are a great way of visualizing these types of changes, but really what we're trying to do through the projects and programs is understand the dependencies across the model. So those Gantt charts provide some level of dependencies. We can see the applications and the technologies, but projects and programs usually encompass a larger set of changes. So if you think of working maybe on a cybersecurity project or an application rationalization project, those changes are going to be impacting many different parts of the organization. If we retire an application, as an example, we would be impacting the resources required to host the application. We would be impacting the processes that use it. We'd likely be impacting the overall cost of our application portfolio. And we may also be impacting the capabilities that require that type of application. So projects provide a really good way, a vehicle of delivery for managing those numbers, costs, complexity, compliance across that entire model. Another key aspect of this as well is when we start looking at the different projects and programs that we're working on, we may want to aggregate some of that data up and down the model. You would have seen that briefly for those lifecycle dates, managing lifecycle dates from the underlying technologies to the group level, but using algorithms in Abacus, we can further cascade those dates across the entire architecture, and then we can actually see the true impact of change for those projects. So again, what does that actually look like in reality, and how best do we depict some of those projects and programs that we're working on? So if we jump back into Abacus Enterprise, and let's this time focus on a particular dashboard around projects. Now, keep in mind when we're building these dashboards, we're likely going to be having different types of users accessing these views. So it's worth considering who will be viewing the dashboards and who will actually be contributing to these. So from a general perspective, Abacus Enterprise is going to be available to anyone within the organization. So as a platform, we will make this a read-only platform for an unlimited number of users that can actually access all of these visualizations. It's a critical part of previous webinars you might have sat on, where we talk about disseminating this information across the organization, a truly collaborative environment where everyone can see the work that's going on. That's really how we're going to be best embedding Abacus within a team. So these read-only users are going to be beneficial for actually understanding all of this information. And if we took a list, in this case, of those projects, one of the first things we typically would be identifying are things like the sponsor or the project manager for these projects. So not only can we allow people to see this information, we can also allow users to come in and actually edit this content as well. This becomes, of course, really beneficial when we start looking at introducing new projects into the model, and we want to show how this project is impacting other parts of the organization, or if we want to simply update existing projects to indicate, in this case, potentially that it's impacting specific capabilities within the model. So again, we have the ability to have these read-only users, but we also have the ability for people to contribute to these data sets as well, which of course is imperative for the upkeep of the maintenance of the information, but also critical so that users feel like they're contributing to a single source of truth here as well. But generally speaking, from a road mapping perspective, what these projects are doing is they are being connected to different data sets within this repository. So each of these projects and programs have connections to all of the areas that they're actually impacting. And then we also have specific properties where we're calculating things like the ROI, the business case, and the overall cost of these projects as well. Coming back to those previous roadmap statuses, we of course have the lifecycle dates in here. We clearly want to track when these projects are going to be affecting different areas of the organization. And once more, coming back to stage one, we also have some kind of recommendation. Has this project been started? Is it in review phase, or has it been completed? So we can start incorporating those different types of roadmaps into a single catalog view like this, so we can start managing those projects and programs more effectively. Now, lists are a great way of seeing this information. However, from a project perspective, one of the key things we usually want to start outlining is how these projects have dependencies across the organization and how they potentially have different clashes across projects as well. One of the best ways of visualizing that type of information is through something like a graph view. So graph view provides the ability for us to drill down through the entire model to see all of these dependencies and interactions across these different data sets. If, for example, we take a look at this rationalization program, we can see we have a number of different projects in here. We also have a number of different projects underneath the customer first program. So for example, we have an application rationalization project. And if I was to expand this, I could see all of the different areas that are going to be affected across the organization. In this case, this project is impacting specific capabilities and specific applications. I can also see we have a single customer view project. So if I wanted to see what that's going to be impacting, I can drill down into that project and see all of its dependencies across the organization. So this time we can see many more dependencies, or at least many more areas of the organization that are going to be impacted by this project. The reason this view becomes useful is, yes, we can understand the impact of a particular change. So drilling down through capabilities or applications or technologies, or in this case, of course, projects, allow us to see all of the connections across the model. More importantly, from a project and road mapping perspective, we can see these interdependencies, potential clashes, two different projects that are likely affecting the same capabilities and applications. And so this is where Abacus becomes quite useful, because traditionally, the chances are is that these data sets were separate, potentially, someone's own Visio diagram or Excel spreadsheet that they were using. By incorporating these into a single repository, we can now actually see the dependencies across these areas. Incredibly useful then if we want to start making changes in the model, we want to analyze what these projects are effectively doing within this organization. We also usually want to capture a list of impacts that those projects are having across the organization. So you've seen how these projects are connected to specific areas, but those types of impacts are going to be different according to different projects. So first of all, the project will likely have some kind of cost implication for potentially decommissioning a particular system or introducing new systems into the organization. That type of change is something that we usually want to capture on that connection. So the single customer view is impacting our ERP financials database, and that change is actually redesigning this particular database. We have a single customer view project. It's impacting our server. There'll likely be some cost savings in here because the changes are actually refreshing or retiring these pieces of infrastructure. So again, that becomes really useful for managing the project changes across the model. We can start using these tables, these graph views and diagrams to effectively understand how those changes are affecting the rest of the team. Coming back to that type 3 roadmap, of course, projects are usually going to follow some kind of Gantt style view as well. So we typically want to be drilling down into those projects to see what those changes are. But usually what we're trying to do from this dashboard perspective is also just highlight the different types of stakeholders who are actually going to be consuming this type of data. Some users prefer Gantt charts. Some users prefer exploring the model to see the impact of change. And some users are just going to prefer going through a list-based view to run their updates. So keep in mind, there's likely a view for every type of user who wants to access these dashboards. And of course, you have full capability of tailoring each of these dashboards. So of course, hiding some of these views, you might not necessarily want people to see the strategic versus operational value for these projects. And all of these things can be fully customized. So you can build a dashboard that's actually going to be useful for that particular stakeholder or that particular audience. So again, you have full control over these. The idea is to keep in mind that every user will likely have a different view of that data set. So let's jump back into the slides because we now have the fourth type of roadmap to cover. And this is what we call the multiple architectures roadmap. Now, for those of you familiar with certain, let's say, notations, let's say Archimate as an example, Archimate has concepts like plateau components, the idea being that we can manage and model different scenarios within an organization. Projects and programs, of course, help us have more granular detail of what's going on within those architectures. But entire architectural models allow us really to analyze things in much more detail. One of the reasons for building multiple architectures is that we're usually managing something like a current state and a future state. That's not always the most common approach. We have customers managing quarters of the year as architectures, some customers managing sandbox areas, some are managing specific projects and programs as entire architectures in their own right. And there are a few pros and cons to doing this. The main benefits really between modeling a different scenario independently is that we can actually run a significant level of analysis against that architecture. And one of the reasons for doing this is when we think of projects that we're working on, the chances are is that we have multiple options to choose from. And when we start building scenarios, we usually want to run this through some kind of trade-off scenario. So if we have projects A, B, and C as options, we actually want to understand, well, what's the technical viability of that particular option? Does one potentially provide a decrease in cost across a particular application portfolio? Does one potentially increase our services that we can offer to our customers? Does one potentially make us more compliant with standards or regulations quicker than another project option? Of course, in reality, this is a trade-off. We might be increasing costs, but become more regulated or reliant on standards. And of course, that's a good thing. That investment is worth it, even if that cost outweighs some of the other areas that are going to be impacted by that particular project. So multiple architectures are always comparing the performance of different scenarios and becomes crucial within Abacus. There are different ways of doing this, but what we'll focus on right now are some of the outputs from those architectures. And then we'll do just a very quick dive into some of the detail in the background for those architectures as well. So let's first explain what does the outcomes of those architectures look like. In practice, when we think of modeling multiple architectures, as an example, let's say we have our as is, our current state, and we're trying to produce some target state or future state, the outcome or deliverable for that architecture for specific stakeholders would be a high-level dashboard showing, or at least focusing, on a few key metrics. In this case, we're focusing specifically on application costs across each of these functional areas. We're focusing on the unavailability statistic, so how available are the services and applications we have. And we're also looking at the number of applications, or generally speaking, the complexity of the application landscape. And the idea is, as a deliverable, we want to indicate what are the benefits of moving towards this target state. I will be the first to admit that this is an unrealistic scenario. Nevertheless, the target state in this particular model is indicating that our costs overall are decreasing across each of these functional application areas. Clearly, that's a good thing. We're also increasing the availability of the services we have by decreasing the unavailability. And we're also reducing the overall complexity of our application landscape. Again, in the real world, this obviously isn't the case. In a true trade-off scenario, we'd actually be looking at potentially increasing our costs to improve the availability potentially. Yes, there'll likely be a decrease in costs because we're rationalizing or decommissioning applications, but this can become your kind of KPI dashboard for highlighting the benefits of those architectures. From an Abacus perspective, the idea is that we're choosing these specific metrics. Like I mentioned before, some of our metrics could be levels of compliance. So if we're trying to become more compliant over these target states, this target state could be an 18-month roadmap, let's say, as an example, and we want to highlight how closely we are to becoming, 85% compliant with a specific standard. We might be looking at improving the performance of some of the processes that we're building. So if we're analyzing process performance in terms of time to complete, we might be using these KPI dashboards to show how after a process reoptimization, we've improved the ability to have less manual tasks involved and time to completion is less overall as well. There are a few other types of views that you can use as a trade-off. You might want to use these kind of spiderweb diagrams to actually focus on a particular architecture or focus on specific KPI portlets as a trade-off. There are many different views that we can use to highlight these KPIs, but certainly this becomes the overall output or deliverable from that architecture. So keep in mind for those 4 types of roadmaps. The first one, we're typically tagging things with recommendations. The second is we're building those lifecycle dates. The third is we're usually building specific project or portfolio changes within the organization. And that fourth is building different scenarios. We can actually start comparing those across the organization. Now, I mentioned those are the initial 4 types, but what I very quickly want to do is highlight a couple of other aspects in Abacus as well. And this extends on those 4 types we've mentioned. Now, the reason for this is those 4 types are what we might classify as fundamental roadmaps within Abacus. These separate types here really just extend on that, provide maybe a bit more of an analysis take on some of those, but also consider things like how we actually communicate some of these changes. So you can see in here, for example, advanced road mapping for a type 5 could be property-based, so aggregating values up and down the model. What's my utilization of a particular data center? Do I need to move resources around? We're really using the properties in Abacus to analyze some of those changes. So having a bit more of an automation method behind the scenes. Statistical analysis extends on that even further. So this is where we start looking at maybe specific costs across the model. Where can we rationalize and where can things be changed? Maybe to reduce costs, but maybe also keep in mind to invest in specific areas as well. That type 7 is really where we start working with customers on very specific domain-focused roadmaps. So specific project timelines focused on specific things like a digital first strategy or adhering to GDPR, which is one of the projects we worked on previously. We're really looking at building very specific domain-related dashboards for that type of audience to consume. And type 8 really is what we call this kind of multi-dimensional one. This is really where we're considering pretty much everything within the organization. And this is where we're really looking at running a very specific business scenario. So if we're looking at focusing on applications with a low criticality score and a high cost and very little number of users, we're combining multiple different dimensions in here to see how we can actually start making changes in the organization. So we're not focusing on one specific metric, we're combining those metrics together to hopefully make more strategic outcomes. It's important to keep in mind, as we've mentioned previously, the chances are these are not linear. We don't move from type 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. The chances are you could already be doing something like a type 8 roadmap in Abacus, but you might just be missing some kind of time aspect of building those life cycle or Gantt charts. The idea is that we want to really combine some of these together to build a really good outcome in terms of dashboards in Abacus for other users to then consume. So just as a few quick things, a quick recap on obviously what we've covered today, which was those 4 key types of roadmaps. Having a road mapping platform, of course, at number 1 there is critical. Of course, in this case, we're recommending Abacus, but we know people have other types of road mapping platforms they use. The main benefit of using something like Abacus, which hopefully you've seen today, is that we're incorporating data across multiple domains. Some tools may be focused specifically on a technology roadmap, and of course, that's great if that's what you're focusing on, but quite often we usually want to see the dependencies across the architecture. If technologies are reaching vendor support, how does that really affect the business? And having a road mapping platform like Abacus hopefully provides that type of capability. Another quick thing would be using standards. So using specific methodologies out of the box. TOGAF, for example, one of those can provide some good best practices on building roadmaps. And specifically that ADM cycle is going to provide some good direction on how to build those architectures. We'd also then recommend building specific algorithms. So analyzing some of that data for understanding how costs fluctuate up and down the model, understanding how those time aspects can also be aggregated up and down the model. That becomes important specifically for things like those lifecycle charts. That 4th one, adapting your presentation style. Again, we have different stakeholders involved. So even if we are using a specific notation behind the scenes, Archimate, BPMN, TOGAF, we might not always want to represent our models in that particular notation. So it's fine to use that for our architectural-based diagrams, but certainly those graph views and Gantt charts can hide the notation, but actually reveal some of the key outcomes or deliverables. So again, adapt some of those styles, graph views, Gantt charts, diagrams, catalogs, matrices. The reason there are many views is that we can adapt those and make sure we're building something that's fit for purpose for the audience that's actually consuming that data. And then finally, of course, demonstrate some business value using those KPIs. That KPI trade-off dashboard where we're focusing on cost or compliance or overall complexity of our landscape, that's really the outcome or deliverable from these architectures. All the work that gets involved in building these types of roadmaps really comes down to what kind of strategic decisions we want to make. Understanding the criticality of applications or the time it takes for a process to complete isn't that useful unless we're actually going to be making some changes to that. How do we reduce those costs? When are we going to reduce those costs? And that's really how these roadmaps become beneficial. We're, of course, going to be following up with further sessions like this in the future. We have some quite exciting stuff coming up as well through our digital summit. If you haven't heard about our digital summit, we've had this for a number of years now, where we bring together customers and, of course, internal consultants at Avolution to discuss specific topics. That could be customers talking about how they use Abacus for specific EA use cases, all the way from masterclasses and breakout session rooms for specific industries. So keep an eye on that. You might be hearing a bit more information about that over the next few weeks and months. But in the meantime, thank you again, everyone. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions or queries, please feel free to reach out.